This is one of those cases that hits the very top of the list for me of just absolute terror and not understanding how this could have happened, and just so much sympathy for the family here.
It's a parent's worst nightmare. A family friend entrusted with the custody of twin 2-year-olds does the unspeakable.
You cannot imagine a more innocent soul than a 2-year-old baby, and a more depraved act of molesting and killing that baby. I mean, it's just literally the worst of the worst.
This is 2-year-old Alistair, a young boy living in Roy, Utah, just 30 minutes north of Salt Lake City. Alistair and his twin sister were in the custody of this man, Jonathan Dunn, in 2023. Dunn was a family friend, even considered an adopted uncle by the twins' parents. But Dunn had a dark past, one that showed up again on December 21st of last year. Just after 10 o'clock that morning, police were called to a home on the city's north side. When emergency responders arrived, they found 2-year-old Alistair on the front porch, and he wasn't breathing. The toddler was rushed to McKay Hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. Investigators later revealed that Alistair was found with several visible injuries to his face and body, and there were injuries on Alistair's twin sister too. Both twins had signs of abuse on their faces, heads, and genitals. The little girl was later hospitalized for a brain bleed. Almost immediately, investigators zeroed in on Dunn, who originally said Alistair had fallen from the couch, and that's why he called 911. But Dunn's story quickly changed, and the truth came out. Dunn admitted to throwing both twins onto the bed when they were crying, which may have injured them. But the real abuse came in the form of a sick game Dunn forced the twins to play. Dunn said as part of the game, he, quote, began to punch the male and female repeatedly in the back and sides and chest. Dunn even admitted he was hitting the children harder than he should have. But Dunn made another bombshell revelation too, that he sexually assaulted both 2-year-olds, pinching them in their genitals. After this abuse, Dunn gave Alistair Tylenol and cough medicine. He gave his sister a children's sleep aid before calling 911. He was eventually charged with aggravated child abuse, aggravated sexual abuse of a child, and aggravated murder in the death of 2-year-old Alistair.
Oh, this is one of the most disturbing cases I have ever seen. We talk a lot about different types of cases here, and there's very often no explanation that you could conjure up as to how this happened and why. This is one of those cases that hits the very top of the list for me of just absolute terror and not understanding how this could have happened, and just so much sympathy for the family here.
To understand this story, we reached out to criminal defense attorney Serena Townsend, who's also a former sex crimes prosecutor. If we're taking a closer look at the details of this really gruesome crime, we know that the defendant in this case was a family friend. Actually, some of the articles refer to him as an adopted uncle who had taken in these kids and was entrusted with watching them and protecting them. To me, that screams the ultimate betrayal, a family friend watching your children. What do you make of that?
I hate to say that it's surprising or rare, but the truth is, I'm a former sex crimes prosecutor. The majority of the cases that I prosecuted, the defendant and the accused was somebody known to the family. Oftentimes, it actually was an uncle or an adopted uncle, if you will, a close family friend. It is actually way more common than I think people realize for the perpetrator to be not just known, but well known and trusted by the family. And it's heartbreaking when something like that happens, but not as rare as we would hope.
So in talking about that, the perpetrator being really close to the family, does that kind of give them a leg up, so to speak? I mean, they have access to these children, they're gaining the trust of these children, and there's someone who these children would never assume would do something bad to them. Does that kind of make things easier for them to get away with these crimes?
Absolutely, because everything that you just said is so true. The access, the trust, the ability for them to come and go as they please. And then also keep in mind, especially with children, a lot of times the children do not tell anybody, right? Children feel like adults are always right. And so they won't necessarily outcry and tell anybody. But now picture a child being molested or sexually abused by an uncle or a trusted person. Then it's exponentially harder to expect a child to actually tell anybody, because we all know that when that happens, a child thinks, oh, my parents are not going to believe me, or I'm going to get in trouble. They trust him, they like him. It's really so sad, because that he was able to take advantage of that fear.
The shocking details of the crime are almost worse because of the victims' ages. Sexual assaults of any kind are horrific for anyone to have to endure, but this one is almost another level because the two twins were 2 years old. I mean, they were toddlers. I am not a former sex crimes prosecutor, which is why I came to you for this case. Is this something that we see, that toddlers are sexually assaulted?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because even my previous point of telling people doesn't even exist here. So he took advantage of a child, a baby, who can't even really say what happened. That makes things, it's interesting. It makes things a lot harder, right? Because you don't have somebody to say, here's what happened, when it happened, how it happened. Those are all very important things for a prosecutor to be able to prove. They have to prove every element of the charge. Usually 9 times out of 10, they do that through the survivor themselves. That being said, on the flip side, it's interesting because in order to be able to prove that case, they obviously would have to get different types of evidence, right? Maybe there was a witness, or there's forensic evidence, scientific evidence, serological evidence like DNA, things like that. And oftentimes, a jury is more willing to believe that type of evidence because it doesn't lie, right? It's proof, it's scientific, hard evidence, rather than a person saying, no, he did it. Sadly, we see that children are so often critiqued by jurors because they sometimes feel like, well, maybe they're exaggerating, or maybe it's just a figment of their imagination, or they're easily manipulated. And so sometimes when you don't have that person to be able to testify, your proof is sometimes even more compelling.
This story is especially gruesome and unfortunately is one of many we cover here on Law and Crime. But the reason we're able to bring you these stories is because of our sponsors. So I wanted to share about one of our sponsors now. That's City Lips. I started using City Lips and truly am in love. I've seen results in as little as 30 seconds. But it's not just me. Over 2 million women have tried City Lips too. I think it's really a game changer because City Lips is the ultimate all-in-one solution. It adds moisture, but has a great look to boot. So right now you can get 15% off City Lips with the code LAW15, or go to citybeauty.com/LCnews. While the details of the crime itself are disturbing, so too is Dunn's history that was apparently ignored when he was granted custody of the twins. Now, according to his prior records, he had actually been convicted of a child abuse charge back in 2017. So to me, that's obviously a red flag. I'm not going to allow my children to hang out with or be babysat by somebody who has these charges against them. But on top of that, he apparently had custody of these kids too, which again is another red flag. I'm kind of confused about all of this. How would he be able to have custody of these two children if he had a child abuse conviction?
He absolutely should not have. However, that conviction played out, first of all, obviously, these children were not even born in 2017. So all of this happened after he was convicted. Some convictions, if they're low level enough, do not require the person to have to register as a sex offender, interestingly enough. Some low level misdemeanor sex offenses, like forcible touching, at least in New York where I practice, low level sex abuse where it's a misdemeanor level rather than a felony level. There's certain types of cases like that where if you take a certain plea, you avoid having to register as a sex offender. So I wonder if what he was convicted of, he was able to avoid doing that. And maybe that red flag was not as bold and bright to the judicial system who gave him custody of these children. Although, you would hope that a judge or our government would look into everything in the past, not just the final conviction, but all of the history before granting access to children after he abused other children.
So we know Dunn had a history of child abuse and even a conviction, but Alistair's death brought Dunn's depravity to a new level. So we've talked about the horrific nature of these sexual assaults, but in addition to that, there's also murder on the table in this case. Unfortunately, one of the twins passed away as a result of his injuries. Is that something that we often see, sex crimes that lead to murder?
You don't I hadn't seen that as often as just, not just, but the sex crime itself. This is just the saddest, most awful result here. We do see sexual acts being committed against very young children, babies. It's really the worst thing ever, but now you add murder on top of it. It is horrific. He must have just done the worst things ever to this poor baby. And to not be able to survive it, I mean, he deserves the sentence that he got, or maybe worse, honestly.
The abuse that resulted in Alistair's death and his sister's brain bleed happened in December of last year. Just this month, Dunn pleaded guilty to his charges: 2 counts of aggravated sexual abuse of a child, 1 count of aggravated child abuse, and 1 count of aggravated murder. If we're going back to the crime itself, it happened way back in December of 2023, but a plea deal was just reached now. And I know that things sometimes move slowly in the world of justice, but why do you think it would have taken so long? Or to counter it, was that a quick plea deal?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally, these cases do take about between a year and 2 years to get to trial. Obviously, this plea deal was in lieu of trial. I have a feeling that both sides were working quite hard to try to figure out what the best result here could be. Obviously, the prosecution probably floored by the horror of this type of case and not really wanting to negotiate much. And then the other side probably needing to work very hard to find any sort of mitigation to present to the prosecution to take the death penalty off of the table or to give him any sense of a plea deal that he'd be willing to take. So I think it probably took time for both sides to come to a point where they'd be okay with resolving the case.
So, a major part of the plea deal is what you just mentioned, that the death penalty would be taken off the table. But let's say they weren't able to reach this sort of plea deal and compromise. It sounds like the death penalty would have been a possibility. Would that have made things even more difficult when it came time to actually try the case?
Yes. So the death penalty, look, a jury knows that that's going to be on the table for the most part, even if they're not told very specifically. And so a prosecution understands that in order to get 12 people to agree that this person committed this crime is hard enough. But when your jury knows what the consequences of a guilty verdict might be, it's even more difficult to convince them to come to that conclusion. Although in this case, I feel like maybe a jury would not have such a hard time coming to that conclusion. My curiosity just goes to what kind of, mitigation did the defense come up with in order to get that death penalty off the table? Because this is pretty much one of the most horrific things you could ever imagine. You cannot imagine a more innocent soul than a 2-year-old baby and a more depraved act of molesting and killing that baby. I mean, it's just literally the worst of the worst. So, I think he's going to die in jail no matter what happens, even though he didn't get the death penalty. And I think that's the fate that he signed himself up for.
So, had Dunn gone to trial, death penalty would likely still be on the table, and so too could be his pattern of abuse. I do have to wonder if this case did end to trial rather than the plea deal that it ended up with, whether the prior bad acts would be allowed in, because we know he has this conviction, but obviously prior bad acts we don't usually include. However, this could potentially be a pattern showing that he had abused children in the past. What's your take on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of very intricate legal things that need to happen in order to get in prior bad acts. Previous convictions are sometimes allowed to be asked about if the person takes the stand in his own defense. So, had he testified for himself at that trial, he might have been able to be confronted with that prior conviction. Had he not testified, there are ways that the prosecution might have been able to introduce the prior bad acts in their case in chief. Sometimes, like you said, it's to show a pattern. It's a way to show absence of mistake. It's a way to show identity. I would probably argue that because this poor baby did not survive and the other baby is not able to speak or testify and point him out and say he's the one who did this, there is a huge burden on the prosecution to prove identity. And if there was a similar pattern there, I would argue that prior bad act would allow me to say to this jury, this is who we know it is who did this because of X, Y, and Z that happened in 2017.
As part of the plea deal, he received life in prison without parole. Do you think that's, I don't want to say getting off easy, but a good compromise for him rather than the death penalty?
In the end, when you calculate both sides, I do, simply because that's almost the toughest sentence he could have gotten, although obviously the death penalty is the ultimate sentence. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind about that. First of all, the prosecution was able to avoid traumatizing or re-traumatizing this entire family. They've been able now to avoid the risk of losing at trial, which you can claim and know that you have a ton of evidence, but at the same time, it is always, always a risk to go to trial. So they were able to check those boxes. And then on the other side of things, when you do have a death penalty case, they are looked at so carefully on the defense side, and there's opportunities to appeal over and over and over again. And so whether he would in fact be put to death is not even a guarantee. I mean, he could even die in prison waiting to be put to death. So the truth of the matter is, I do think it's the right outcome.
After Alistair's death, his family released a statement reading, quote, "We as a family are grieving the devastating loss of sweet Alistair and the severe injuries of his twin sister. As we attempt to put our lives back together after this unbelievable tragedy, we are choosing to honor Alistair's life and memory as we process our grief. We ask the media to kindly respect our privacy during this very difficult time. The support we have felt by many is appreciated more than we can express." Jonathan Dunn's official sentencing is set for August 21st. Until then, he's being held at the Weber County Jail. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.